July 28, 1981. Diana Spencer, 20 years old, goes to bed at Clarence House. Tomorrow she will be watched by approximately 750 million people when she marries the heir to the British throne at St. Paul's Cathedral. Tonight she is sleeping under the roof of the woman who will later be documented, in the pages of her own official biography, as having regarded Diana with utter abhorrence. The woman who has just given her a sapphire and diamond brooch as a wedding gift. The woman who is, by every public account available to the British public in 1981, one of the most warmly regarded figures in the entire country. One house, two realities, arriving in sequence. The public image of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, is one of the most carefully maintained constructions in 20th century British history, and by 1981, she had been building it for 45 years. Cecil Beaton, the society photographer who had documented royalty at close range across 5 decades and had the access to know what he was actually looking at, described her as a marshmallow. The word stuck because it matched what the country saw: a small, round, endlessly cheerful woman in pastel suits and wide-brimmed hats, almost always smiling, almost always mid-toast with something gin adjacent, the embodiment of a specifically British kind of domestic comfort. Her wartime associations were total and fully earned. She had refused to leave London during the Blitz, had walked through bombed East End neighborhoods in her pearls, had declared publicly that she could now look those areas in the face. Every photograph from those years showed the same expression: resolute, warm, unbroken. The effect was deliberate and cumulative, and it worked across generations. Questioning her warmth would have seemed not just impolite, but almost incoherent. The smile had been there for 60 years. By 1981, it was simply considered a fact about her, like height or accent. This, precisely, is what made the performance so useful. Edward, Duke of Windsor, had been watching it longer than almost anyone. Edward had abdicated the British throne in December 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. He spent the subsequent decades in Paris and Nassau and Cap d'Antibes, observing from a very specific geographic remove as the royal family he had abandoned consolidated and rehabilitated itself under his brother and his brother's wife. In 1971, from Paris, Edward gave his assessment to a visitor. "Behind that great abundance of charm," he said, "is a shrewd, scheming, and extremely ruthless woman." Edward was, by that point, the central exhibit in the case he was describing. To understand the Queen Mother's behavior toward Diana, the brooch and then the abhorrence, the welcome and then the freeze-out, all of it, you have to start in December 1936, because that is where the moral architecture that governed her treatment of Diana was built. When Edward chose Wallis over the crown, the throne passed to his younger brother Prince Albert, who became King George VI. Albert was 40 years old at his accession. He had not been raised for kingship, had not been formed for it, had not wanted it. He had spent his adult life building around the expectation of remaining a private royal, attending ceremonies and supporting the main line without the central burden. He lived with a severe stammer, a condition he had struggled with since childhood, that made public speaking, the foundational performative act of a modern constitutional monarch, a form of sustained private ordeal. He had worked with speech therapist Lionel Logue for years, simply to manage public addresses. Edward's abdication handed him an empire, a world war, and a schedule of public duties that placed the most difficult thing he did every day at the center of every day. She watched this. She watched it for 16 years. She handled the foreign ministers and the prime ministers, and the state occasions and the palace schedules. She managed the public performance of continuity and strength through the Blitz and through the post-war collapse of empire, and through 2 decades of constitutional upheaval, while simultaneously managing a husband whose private anxiety about his position was considerable and real, and had never been fully resolved. When George VI died in February 1952, he was 56 years old, relatively young even by the standards of his own family. She had been watching for 16 years the specific damage that one man's decision to put personal desire above duty had done to another man she loved. She knew what the sequence looked like from inside. She knew what it cost. William Shawcross's official biography, compiled from the Queen Mother's personal papers with unrestricted access after her death, includes what he described as her anguished private thoughts on the abdication crisis, confirming the depth of the feeling was genuine, not performed. In public, she maintained the marshmallow. In the ledger she kept internally, a principle had been written in permanent ink. The individual does not get to put their private needs above the institution. The institution is what survives. Break it, and everyone who depends on it pays. She had watched one person's selfishness pay out its full cost in her husband's exhausted body and early death, and she was never going to allow herself to forget the mechanism. She built her entire operational approach to royal life around preventing it from happening again. Wallis Simpson, Duchess of Windsor, was 40 years old when Edward abdicated for her. She lived to 89. For the entire intervening span of nearly 5 decades, the Queen Mother maintained a documented, deliberate institutional vendetta against her. She refused to grant Wallis the title Her Royal Highness, leaving her one formal rank below what her husband's former standing implied, so that every occasion where titles mattered became a reminder of what the institution had decided Wallis was worth. She organized the Windsors' social and geographic exile. Edward and Wallis spent decades in Nassau and Paris, at a distance from the court that was maintained not by accident or geography, but by sustained management. When Edward died in 1972, and his body was brought to Windsor for lying in state, Wallis was brought to Buckingham Palace during the formal period of mourning. She was treated, by all accounts, with a correctness so precise and so cold that it constituted its own category of cruelty, correct on every visible metric, and entirely devoid of warmth. Wallis was 89 when she died in 1986. The Queen Mother had been applying the same treatment for 50 years. When Princess Margaret fell in love with the divorced RAF group captain Peter Townsend in the early 1950s, the Queen Mother opposed the relationship, not because she found Townsend personally objectionable. He was decorated, respected, entirely admirable on his own terms. He was divorced. The institution of which Margaret was a royal member didn't accommodate divorce, and the institution's requirements came before Margaret's private happiness. Margaret accepted this in October 1955 and issued a formal statement of renunciation, framed in the language of duty to the Commonwealth and to the Church of England. The Queen Mother had raised a daughter who knew how to make the statement correctly and didn't put her personal needs above the institutional need for her to make it. This is a coherent ideology applied with 40-year consistency. The mechanisms vary: the denial of a title, the geographic exile, the private renunciation. But the logic is constant. Personal happiness isn't the point. The crown is the point. Someone places personal desire above duty. The Queen Mother identifies the threat to the structure. The exclusion follows. What the history of Wallis Simpson and Peter Townsend establishes, with high confidence, is that this wasn't a personality trait Diana happened to trigger. It was a governing principle the Queen Mother had been operating by for decades before Diana entered the picture. The principle predicted, with considerable accuracy, what was coming. It's always a mistake to talk about your marriage. The Queen Mother told this to William Shawcross, during the research for her official biography, and Shawcross reported it. The Los Angeles Times review of the resulting book cited it. It's 7 words, and it contains her entire worldview. Not, "It's painful to talk about your marriage," or "difficult," or "inadvisable under certain circumstances." Always a mistake, every time. Whatever the circumstances, whatever is happening inside the marriage, whatever the cost of silence. The phrase, "never complain, never explain," is the unofficial motto of the British royal family. Its origin is with the Victorian Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, not the royals themselves. But no one in the 20th century operationalized it more completely than the Queen Mother. She had demonstrated that principle across the abdication, the wartime, Margaret's sacrifice, and the 40-year Wallis Vendetta. Not publicly complaining, not publicly explaining, keeping the institution's internal reality inside the institution, and presenting the carefully managed exterior to the world that depended on the performance of stability. This is the context in which Diana's conduct, Diana's emotional openness, Diana's visibility, Diana's willingness to have needs and then to say so, was received. The Queen Mother wasn't simply annoyed by Diana. She was watching someone do the precise thing she had built a lifetime of discipline around, not doing. And she had a framework, honed across 50 years, for what to do about it. Ruth Roach, Baroness Fermoy, was Diana's maternal grandmother. She was also the Queen Mother's woman of the bedchamber, a position she had held since 1960, 1 year before Diana was born, and would hold for more than 3 decades. The role of woman of the bedchamber isn't a domestic service position. It places the holder inside the innermost operational circle of the royal household, attending formal occasions, accompanying the royal principal on official engagements, managing the social rhythms and personal schedule of a life that is permanently interwoven with public function. The person holding it's chosen for complete personal trust. You aren't hired to be someone's woman of the bedchamber. You're chosen because you're the kind of person who can be trusted at that level of proximity. Fermoy held the role for 33 years. Her official record describes the relationship as one of a friend and confidant. In practical terms, she was the woman the Queen Mother talked to. She was present in the private hours and the formal ones, across decades, in the household that was the nerve center of the most politically significant family in Britain. The Fermoy family's integration into the royal world ran deeper than Fermoy's own employment. When Diana's parents married in 1954, the ceremony was attended by the Queen, Prince Philip, the Queen Mother, and Princesses Margaret and Anne. The Fermoys weren't on the guest list as a courtesy. They were present because their relationship to the royal circle was structural, not peripheral. Diana grew up knowing this, knowing that her grandmother occupied the Queen Mother's intimate world, moved through it with complete authority, was trusted within it unconditionally. This was the heir of her childhood. Her grandmother wasn't someone who occasionally attended royal events. Her grandmother ran the household. When Charles's interest in Lady Diana Spencer emerged in the summer of 1980, this structural fact was significant in ways that went beyond social introduction. Diana was a known quantity inside the Queen Mother's household before Charles had formed any serious romantic intention. The Tatler noted that Fermoy was always rumored to have played matchmaker for her granddaughter. Fermoy denied this directly when asked. "You can say that if you like, but it simply wouldn't be true." But the rumor persisted because it reflected a structural reality. Whether Fermoy actively engineered introductions or simply allowed her proximity to the Queen Mother's circle to make Diana's candidacy visible and credible, the result was equivalent. Diana's name arrived pre-vouched in the household that mattered most, carried by the woman who had spent 30 years earning the right to vouch for anyone in that circle. and Fermoy thought it was going to be a disaster. Andrew Morton's account of the period records that Fermoy told Diana directly, before the engagement, "Darling, you must understand that their sense of humor and their lifestyle are different, and I don't think it will suit you." This was the most honest sentence Fermoy ever said to her granddaughter. She had spent 33 years inside the institution. She knew exactly what it required and what it cost and what it did to people who needed warmth from a household that ran on protocol. She was, by Morton's account, the only person close to the situation who said out loud that the marriage was a mistake. Diana, who had met Charles romantically a total of 13 times before the proposal, went ahead anyway. The warning is either an act of genuine love or the gesture that let Fermoy sleep at night in the years that followed. There is a case for both readings, and the two aren't mutually exclusive. There is an earlier incident that establishes how Fermoy's loyalties settled when forced into the open, and it predates the royal marriage by more than a decade. In 1969, when Diana's mother Frances went through her divorce from Viscount Althorp, the custody dispute placed Fermoy in a direct conflict between her own daughter and the Althorp family's position. She testified against Frances in court. The Independent's obituary of Fermoy recorded this: "She chose the side that aligned with social propriety and the establishment." Diana was 8 years old when her grandmother testified against her mother. The significance of this isn't subtle. When Fermoy faced an explicit conflict between institutional loyalty and protecting a member of her own family, she had already shown, once under oath, how she resolved it. She chose the establishment. She chose Frances's ex-husband's position over Frances. The pattern was established before Diana was old enough to understand what a pattern was. When the same terms arrived again in the 1990s, crown or granddaughter, Fermoy had already answered the question. She had answered it in 1969 against Frances. She answered it again against Diana. By the time Fermoy died on July 6, 1993, she and Diana weren't on speaking terms. She had been positioned as a bridge between two worlds, the only person who stood in both Diana's family and the Queen Mother's household simultaneously. The one person who could have been Diana's advocate in the place where Diana's standing mattered most. She chose not to be. In July 1981, the full shape of any of this is unknowable to anyone involved. The initial welcome is real. Diana spent the night before her wedding at Clarence House. Her own fragmented memory of that night survived in the recorded material Morton later worked from. "We were getting up at Clarence House," is the domestic detail, the sleepy, nervous note of the night before. The Queen Mother attended the wedding of Nicholas Soames and Catherine Wetherill alongside Diana, Princess Margaret, and Charles on June 4, 1981. One of Diana's first documented appearances inside the Queen Mother's immediate social circle, weeks before the wedding. The sapphire and diamond brooch was given to Diana as a wedding gift. Later accounts note she wore it adapted as a necklace, and that it eventually passed to William and Harry. The gesture communicated what sapphires and diamonds have communicated in royal circles across centuries. You are accepted. You belong here. The Queen Mother had decided Diana was the right candidate, had watched her enter the family with what appears to have been genuine approval, and had marked the entry with material generosity. The house was open. The jewelry was given. The night before the wedding, Diana slept there. The house that would later become, in Diana's experience, a place of watching and judgment and exclusion was, on July 28, 1981, simply where she prepared to become a princess. The marriage was fracturing before the ink on the register was entirely dry. The internal chronology, Charles's ongoing relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, Diana's developing bulimia, the emotional isolation of a 20-year-old placed inside a household built entirely on formality and precedent and emotional restraint, is documented extensively in Morton and elsewhere. What matters here isn't the marriage's internal sequence, but the Queen Mother's reading of what was happening and what that reading produced. Andrew Morton's account describes the Queen Mother as unfavorably disposed to Diana and to Diana's mother, Frances Shand Kidd, the same Frances against whose custody claim her own mother, Fermoy, had testified in 1969. The dispositions of these two women toward Diana and Frances were, demonstrably, not unrelated. Morton wrote that the Queen Mother exercises an enormous influence over the Prince of Wales. Charles was the Queen Mother's first grandchild, the closest to her of all her grandchildren, the one she had actively helped form. There is a documented record of her instructing him in the Royal Gallery, the older generation shaping the heir's understanding of his role and his inheritance. When the marriage began to fail and Charles needed guidance, the guidance available to him ran through a woman who had already concluded his wife was the wrong shape for the institution she served. One academic study, drawing on multiple contemporary sources, noted that the Queen Mother was astonished at the unruliness of Spencer women, a trait upheld by Diana. The word unruliness carries a specific charge within royal culture that has nothing to do with breaking formal rules. It means visible feelings, needs expressed rather than managed, unhappiness that doesn't perform itself as composure. Diana cried at official events. She sought emotional warmth from a household that distributed warmth the way the Treasury distributed funding, according to institutional priorities, not according to who needed it most. One source describes Diana searching for emotional closeness that the Queen wasn't able to provide her. The same was true of the Queen Mother. Diana reached toward warmth in both directions and found marble in both hands. She understood what she was dealing with. She began keeping what Morton described as a distrustful distance from the Queen Mother, deliberate, calculated management of proximity to someone she had assessed as unsafe. She believed Clarence House functioned as a source of negative sentiment directed against her, a center of gravity in the court that pulled toward Charles and away from her. The house that had hosted her the night before her wedding had become, in her experience of the mid-1980s, a place she moved past carefully. At some point before her death in August 1997, the sources place it at a private lunch with a Guardian journalist, Diana described the Queen Mother in terms that were published in a Guardian feature in July 2000, in a piece titled The Enforcer. The journalist recorded, "The chief leper in the leper colony was how the princess once described to me over a gossipy lunch the woman Cecil Beaton had once called a marshmallow." The same attribution appeared in the Guardian's Queen Mother obituary piece in March 2002. The quote isn't from the Morton tapes. The 18,000-word transcript contains Diana's voice on many subjects, but this particular line comes from a journalist's first-hand account of a private encounter, published posthumously. The metaphor isn't casual, and it wasn't chosen lightly. Diana was internationally recognized for her work with leprosy patients. She had visited leprosy hospitals in Indonesia in 1989 and Nigeria in 1990. She sat with patients, held their hands, embraced them in front of cameras without gloves, at a time when the vast majority of public figures maintained careful physical distance from anyone associated with the disease, not because they were medically required to, but because the social stigma of leprosy had outlasted by decades the medical reality of its transmission. The entire point of those images was deliberate destigmatization. Diana understood how images worked, understood the mechanism of the royal gaze, and what it communicated when directed at someone. She pointed it at people who were used to being the object of aversion. The photographs circulated worldwide. They shifted something. For Diana to apply that specific vocabulary to the royal family required that she was doing something deliberate. She wasn't reaching for a quick insult. She was drawing on the most precise and considered language available to her for describing what stigma looks like from the inside. what it means to be marked, excluded, treated as untouchable by the community that is supposed to contain you. And she was applying it to the people who had done that to her. The Queen Mother, warmly regarded by the British public for 60 years, photographed for 6 decades as the smiling center of the national family, was, in Diana's analysis, the most thoroughly marked among them, the most afflicted, the one whose exclusionary logic was oldest, most practiced, most total, the chief leper. Coming from a woman who had deliberately touched lepers in public to make a point about their humanity, this wasn't a throwaway line. It was a precisely aimed piece of language from someone who had been living for years inside what it described. June 1992. Andrew Morton's Diana, Her True Story was published. Morton had worked with Diana in secret throughout 1991. She recorded answers to his questions on tape at Kensington Palace, alone, sitting with a dictaphone, responding to prepared questions in her own voice, the sessions conducted entirely without the palace's knowledge. There was real risk in this. Diana was still a working member of the royal family in 1991, still attending official engagements, still part of the public performance of a marriage that was, behind the performance, a documented wreckage. She recorded 18,000 words of her own testimony while occupying a palace bedroom. She authorized friends and family members to speak to Morton separately, providing additional testimony and corroboration. The resulting book was published across 30 countries and became one of the best-selling titles in Britain. It disclosed that Diana had attempted to take her own life on at least 5 separate occasions during the 1980s. It disclosed bulimia, described in detailed personal terms. It described the texture of the marriage in the vocabulary of someone who had lived inside it, the unavailability of Charles, the absence of support from the family she had married into, the specific isolation of being inside an institution that presented itself to the world as a functional family while operating, in Diana's experience, as the precise opposite of one. The institution's response to her distress, described in the book, was essentially maintain the schedule. She had attempted suicide 5 times, and the household's response had been to ensure she appeared on time at the next public engagement. The Queen Mother had spent 56 years, from the abdication in December 1936 to the day the Morton book appeared in June 1992, ensuring that no internal fracture of the institution became publicly legible. She had kept her husband's private struggles invisible throughout his reign, and her own anguish about the abdication locked inside private papers that wouldn't be opened for decades. She had maintained the public face through the Blitz, through Empire's End, through her daughter's sacrifice of Townsend, through 40 years of keeping Wallis Simpson outside the circle. She had said, and meant it, that it is always a mistake to talk about your marriage. Diana had not just talked about it. She had recorded it in her own voice, authorized corroborating sources, translated it into 30 languages, and placed it in every bookshop in Britain. She had done the one thing the entire institutional architecture of the royal family, and the Queen Mother's personal philosophy in particular, existed to prevent. She had opened the machinery to public view and said, in her own words, with her own name on it, "This is what it does to people inside." William Shawcross, working from the Queen Mother's personal papers, with unrestricted access for the official biography published in 2009, documented her reaction in terms the Telegraph reported that October: utter abhorrence at Diana's decision to wash the dirty linen in public. Multiple accounts confirmed she was deeply shocked. The International Business Times, citing a biographer's account, described her as having detested Diana for what she had done. The precision here matters. The abhorrence wasn't directed at 5 suicide attempts, not at the bulimia, not at the emotional abandonment of a young woman left alone inside an institution that was supposed to be her family. The utter abhorrence was directed at the act of disclosure itself, at the washing of the linen in public. From the Queen Mother's perspective, Diana's conduct wasn't the cry of someone in genuine crisis. It was an act of deliberate institutional sabotage, and the distinction between those two readings tells you everything about what the Queen Mother's value system actually was, and how completely it held, even in the face of documented human suffering. She believed she was right. That is what makes it darker, not lighter. A personal vendetta can be argued with. A principle applied with 60 years of sincere conviction is something else entirely. Princess Margaret burned the letters. Andrew Morton revealed this, and the Telegraph covered the disclosure in 2009 under the headline, "Destroyed, the letters that fueled a royal feud." Morton described the correspondence between Diana and the Queen Mother as having actively driven the conflict between them. Margaret, the Queen Mother's daughter, destroyed it. The contents are now permanently unknowable. What remains is the fact of the destruction, and what it implies about what the letters contained. The never complain, never explain principle, in its most practical application, means this. If you can't control what was said, you eliminate the record of its having been said. Diana had spent her adult life trying to tell the truth about her experience inside the institution. She had recorded 18,000 words on tape. She had given an interview to Martin Bashir in 1995, watched by 23 million people in Britain alone, in which she described the marriage, the eating disorder, the isolation, and named Camilla. She had refused repeatedly and at significant personal cost to perform a version of her life that the institution found acceptable. Her most direct written correspondence with its matriarch, the letters exchanged at the height of the feud, in the private register that written correspondence makes possible, in the months when everything was fracturing most completely, was reduced to ash. Whether Margaret acted on instruction or independent judgment, the decision reflected the institution's fundamental logic. The record is a vulnerability. Diana's words, in her own hand, addressed to the Queen Mother and the Queen Mother's words back, were too revealing to preserve. Whatever was said in those letters, it was judged more damaging in existence than in absence. Diana's testimony was systematically eliminated from the closest quarters of the institution, and the woman whose abhorrence had helped generate it died having ensured it wouldn't be available. December 9, 1992. Prime Minister John Major stood before the House of Commons and announced the formal separation of the Prince and Princess of Wales. What followed for Diana was consistent across multiple accounts. She became persona non grata at Clarence House. Andrew Morton documented the Queen Mother as playing an integral role in isolating Diana from the rest of the royal family, following the separation. Major Colin Burgess, who served as equerry to the Queen Mother during the 1990s and wrote about his years at Clarence House in Behind Palace Doors, documented the atmosphere of the household during this period. The full specifics of what he recorded aren't entirely recoverable from publicly available excerpts, but the general picture is confirmed from multiple directions. After December 1992, Diana wasn't welcomed, not contacted, not acknowledged in any way that implied the relationship that had begun with a sapphire brooch still existed in any form. The mechanism was the one she had already applied to Wallis Simpson for 40 years. No title for Wallis, no access for Diana. No formal place in royal life for Wallis, no contact with the Queen Mother's household for Diana. The logic was identical because the analytical framework was identical. Here is a person who threatened the institution's stability. The institution must be protected. Protection requires exclusion. Exclusion means making the person invisible to the circles that matter. The difference in timeline, Wallis across 50 years, Diana across 5, reflects the speed with which the rupture was total, rather than the severity of the response. But there is a distinction between Diana's case and Wallis Simpson's that the mechanism alone doesn't capture. Wallis had never been inside. She had never slept at Clarence House the night before her wedding. She had never received a piece of the Queen Mother's jewelry as a mark of formal acceptance into the family. She had never been integrated into the social occasions of the Queen Mother's circle in the way Diana had been, from the June 1981 Soames wedding onward. The journey from outside to outside, which is what Wallis traveled, is categorically different from the journey from inside to outside. You have to have been welcomed to experience what expulsion actually feels like. Diana had been welcomed. The sapphire made that concrete. Its symbolic withdrawal, the closing of the Clarence House door, was felt at the same register of intimacy in which the original welcome had been extended. The Queen Mother was 92 in December 1992. She attended Ascot the following summer. She was photographed consistently, raising a glass with the expression of someone who was genuinely enjoying the occasion. The public image absorbed none of what was happening in private. At 93, 94, 95, the pastel suits and wide-brimmed hats and perpetual smile continued without visible interruption. The distance between the marshmallow and the woman who had reacted to Diana's suffering with utter abhorrence wasn't visible from the outside. It wasn't designed to be. August 1996. The divorce between Charles and Diana was finalized. Diana retained the title Princess of Wales, but lost the style Her Royal Highness, a detail that wouldn't have been lost on the woman who had spent 4 decades ensuring that Wallis Simpson retained no claim to royal styling. The precedent for what it meant to be stripped of HRH, used against Wallis in perpetuity, was applied to Diana at the moment of formal separation from the institution. Diana was 35 years old. Diana was killed in Paris in the early hours of August 31st, 1997. She was 36. The car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel occurred after midnight local time, and by the time the news reached Britain in the early hours, the royal family was at Balmoral in Scotland. They stayed there. For the days immediately following Diana's death, the palace gates in London remained shut. No flag was flown at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, the protocol being that the only flag flown there was the royal standard, which was only raised when the monarch was in residence, and no public statement of grief came from the family at Balmoral. Flowers began accumulating outside the locked gates within hours. By the end of the first day, they covered the pavement. Within the week, the tribute covered acres of Hyde Park. Hundreds of thousands of people were coming to lay flowers for a woman who had been legally divorced from the institution for exactly 1 year when she died, who had been stripped of HRH, who had been persona non grata at the Queen Mother's residence for 5 years. The Queen's eventual return to London and televised address to the nation on September 5th, 5 days after Diana's death, was widely read as a concession to the scale of public feeling that the palace's initial silence had failed to match. It was an unusual enough departure from the never complain, never explain principle to register as a structural moment. The institution had been forced to respond publicly to a death it had preferred, by practice, to absorb in silence. No documented statement from the Queen Mother about Diana's death has been located in any biographical account or archival record from this period. No disclosed diary entry, no reported remark to staff or family during the week at Balmoral. Shawcross had unrestricted access to her personal papers and didn't publish anything of this nature. Whether she grieved privately and kept it inside the same rules that governed everything else, or whether the persona non grata position she had maintained since December 1992 required no modification even now, that question isn't answerable from the available evidence. The silence was completely consistent with 60 years of practice. She had never said anything publicly about Diana in life. The record shows nothing in death. She lived until March 30th, 2002. She outlived Diana by nearly 5 years. Whatever she made of those 5 years, of the extraordinary scope of public grief that Diana's death had produced, of the retrospective reassessment of how Diana had been treated, of the distance between the public's response to Diana and the institution's documented response to her, she kept it where she kept everything else. Inside. The sapphire and diamond brooch reportedly passed to William and Harry. The piece that the Queen Mother had given their mother as a material expression of welcome, "You are accepted, you belong here," is now in the possession of the sons, whose mother was, for the final 5 years of her life, not permitted to be named in the Queen Mother's presence. That is the record left by a woman who was publicly beloved for a century, who maintained her warmth so consistently and so completely that the cruelty behind it was nearly invisible. The cruelty had a target, and the target was a 20-year-old who slept in her house the night before her wedding, received her jewelry, and was later found, by the woman who gave her both, to be an object of utter abhorrence for the act of describing what that marriage had done to her. Edward saw it from Paris in 1971 and said so plainly. Diana felt it from inside and said so in the only vocabulary she could make the institution hear, which was, of course, precisely the act the Queen Mother could never forgive. Subscribe for more stories like this